Hi everyone, it's Kathy. Thank you so much for joining me. Today I'll be sharing how to create a spooky luminary for Halloween. I'll be using the new Build a Graveyard die set, which has so many fabulous dies. I'll also be using the Wonky stitched rectangle dies to cut the windows out for the luminary. To start, you'll need 2 pieces of cardstock that measures 5.5 by 8.5. 2 skinny strips that measure 1/2 inch by 5.5 inches, and 4 pieces of vellum that measure 4 by 5.25. To start out, you need to score both pieces of the black cardstock in half at 4.25. A lot of the process for this project is pretty repetitive, so I did cut quite a bit of it out. For the skinny strips, you want to score those in half at 1/4 inch, and I do recommend that you use a fairly heavyweight cardstock. For my project, the black cardstock that I used is 104-pound cardstock, I believe. I'll have more information about that cardstock over on my blog, and I'll make sure to link to that in the description below. After you have everything scored, you want to make sure that you burnish those score lines really well, especially on these tiny little strips here. Those are actually going to become tabs to hold the other 2 pieces of cardstock together to form the luminary. After I burnished the score lines really well, I used the second largest Wonky stitched rectangle die to cut windows into both of my black panels. So I centered it up as best as I could on one side. I ran it through my Gemini Junior, and I made sure to have it flat when I ran it through so it would only cut through that one side first. Then I moved the die to the other side so that I could cut the second window. And again, you do want to repeat this process on the other piece of black cardstock. Next, I adhered the pieces of vellum on the inside of this panel here. And I know that it's the inside because the scored line is actually a valley fold. Now, I had mentioned that the vellum should measure 4 by 5.25, and I forgot to trim mine down. So for this first piece that I applied, I did have to trim a little bit of excess off with my scissors. And off camera, I had trimmed the other 3 pieces of vellum down to that 4 by 5.25. Then I started to prep my little strips that are going to hold my 2 large pieces of black cardstock together. So with them folded in half, you want to trim off the end at an angle, and you don't have to trim a whole lot, just a tiny little bit. Next, you want to apply some very strong adhesive, and I used score tape for my project, and apply it along one side of that little strip of cardstock. And you want to make sure when you apply the score tape on these strips that the fold is actually a mountain fold so that the adhesive is on the correct side. You also want to make sure that you get the adhesive centered down that strip as best as you can. Next, remove the release paper from that strip, and you're going to apply that along the edge of one of the panels. And for this, you want to make sure that the fold line is very, very close to the edge of the larger panel. I did find it easier to apply these little strips when they were folded in half. It was easier for me to see that I was getting it really close to the edge. And again, I burnished it with my bone folder to make sure that that adhesive was nice and stuck. Next, you want to flip the panel over and open up those little tabs and apply adhesive to the edges of those little tabs. And again, you want to make sure that the adhesive is centered on those flaps as best as you can. And again, I used my bone folder to burnish the adhesive really well. So the 4 pieces of cardstock that were cut out using the Wonky stitched rectangle die are going to be used for the inside of the luminary to create a little hill. So I trimmed them down so that they were 4 inches wide, and then I just used my scissors to cut a rough hill. You could use a hill die to do this, or even a grassy hill die would be fun. Anyway, to work on the scene for the inside of the luminary, I adhered 2 of the tombstones to the back side of my hand-cut hill. And for this, you do want to make sure that you adhere the tombstones to the back of that piece of cardstock, so it appears that it's seamless once you adhere this hill on the inside of the luminary. I had die cut the cats from a dark gray cardstock, and I wanted to add some color behind their eyes. So I had this limeish, yellowish green cardstock, and I just cut tiny little pieces and added a little bit of liquid glue to the back of the cats. And then I pressed the cats on top of that yellowish, greenish cardstock to adhere that behind their eyes so that they would look like they were glowing. Before I adhered my tombstones and my hill on the inside, I measured it to make sure that the hill wasn't so high that it would obstruct the light from the tea light. So I had measured my tea light, and it measures about 1.5 inches from the base to the top of the flame. So I shifted the luminary so I could see where the proper placement would be for the tombstones and made a little mark with my pencil. I just trimmed off the excess of that little hill, and I did do this for all 4 sides. And then I measured it again just to make sure that I did trim enough off of the bottom. Next, I started to adhere the elements on the outside of the luminary, and I put the cat down first to make sure that he was centered, and then I adhered the gates on either side of him. And again, this is pretty repetitive. I created the same scene on all 4 panels, so I'm only going to share how I put one panel together. I would recommend that you do use a strong liquid glue to adhere these elements to make sure that they don't fall off. Once I had the cat and those 2 fences in place, I flipped it over and I adhered the tombstones into place. And to make sure that I was able to hide the adhesive, I flipped it to the front to see where I could put glue on the spikes of the wrought iron fence, just to be able to add a little bit more stability for those tombstones. I put liquid glue on the bottom of the hill, and then I put dots of liquid glue on the cat and the tail, and then 2 of the spikes of the wrought iron fence, and then a line of glue on the vellum to make sure I had good adhesion for my hill with the tombstones. Once I had my tombstones in place, I decided to add the bats to the front, and I started with the largest bat, and I put the largest bat lower because he would appear to be much closer. And then I put the medium bat above him, and then the smallest bat above that bat. Now that all of the elements are adhered to all 4 panels, it's time to put it together. So what you want to do is remove the release paper from the tab of one side and take the second panel, and when you adhere the second panel to the first panel, you want to make sure that you get those edges lined up and butted up right next to each other. Fold it in half and burnish it really well to make sure that the adhesive is nice and stuck. Then you'll remove the release paper from the other tab, and you'll fold that tab down and then adhere it to the final panel that's underneath it. And again, you want to make sure that the edges are as close to each other as possible. And again, I did use my bone folder to burnish along those adhesive lines to make sure that they're stuck really well. And that's it. That finishes up the luminary. All that you have to do is add a battery-operated tea light candle. Please do not use a real candle with a real flame. Remember, this is paper, and it will go up in flames. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, please give it a thumbs up. If you've not yet subscribed, we'd love it if you would. And don't forget to ring the bell so you're notified every time a new video is posted. Thanks again, and we'll see you next time.